She didn't reach for the doll. That's what paralyzed him. Any other child would have run from the $400,000 roar of his custom engine or the man in hand-tailored silk who stepped out into the downpour outside the syndicate headquarters. A normal child would have been terrified of the ink-stained neck and the clinical coldness of his eyes. But this little girl just stood there in her damp pink dress and worn sneakers, her messy hair plastered to her forehead, looking at him with the hollow politeness of someone who had already been told no by the rest of the world. The baby doll lay, face down in a puddle between them, a discarded casualty of a childhood that had ended blocks ago. "Mister, can you tell me where unwanted kids go?" she asked. Her voice was thin, voiced like she was trying to take up as little space in his world as possible. Cassian Varelli had walked out of those doors having just calculated the deletion of 2 rival assets before dawn. He was the Iron Vulture, a man who viewed the city as a ledger of liabilities and power moves. He looked at the child. Then he looked at his lead enforcer, whose hand was already reaching to move the shivering obstacle out of the boss's path. The enforcer froze. The look on Cassian's face had shifted into something the syndicate hadn't seen in a decade. Cassian dropped to one knee, heedless of the mud ruining his suit, until his eyes were level with hers. Behind him, a dozen of the most ruthless men in Chicago stood motionless in the rain, their breaths hitching in their chests. Not one of them had ever seen the Iron King kneel for anyone. Stay with me until the end, because what the Mafia boss did next shattered everyone's expectations. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. The car door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud that seemed to swallow the sound of the Chicago rain. Inside the Bentley, the air smelled of expensive leather, cedarwood, and the faint, metallic tang of the city. Cassian didn't look at the driver, nor did he acknowledge the 3 blacked-out SUVs forming a protective perimeter around them as they pulled away from the curb. He only looked at the small, shivering shape huddled against the passenger door. Amaris sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the abandoned baby doll resting on the floor mats. She looked like a drop of spilled ink on a pristine page, a splash of frantic, damp pink against the seamless black interior of his world. They moved through the city in a silence that felt like a hell breath. Cassian had spent 34 years mastering the art of the vacuum, surrounding himself with men who spoke only when necessary and walls that didn't talk back. He had built an empire on the principle that noise was a vulnerability. But the sound of Amaris's shallow, ragged breathing was louder than any gunshot he had ever heard. It was a rhythmic reminder that something fragile had breached his hull. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a clean, gray cashmere throw, draping it over her shoulders without a word. She didn't flinch, but she didn't wrap it around herself either. She simply let the weight of it settle over her, accepting the warmth as if it were a temporary loan she'd eventually have to pay back with interest. The Varelli estate sat on the edge of the lake, a sprawling monolith of reinforced glass, brushed steel, and shadows. To the rest of the world, it was a masterpiece of modern architecture. To Cassian, it was a tactical necessity. As the gates hummed open, the security lights swept over the car, illuminating the rows of high-definition cameras and the men in tactical gear stationed at the perimeter. This was the Glass Fortress, a place designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. It was a kingdom of stone where mercy had never been a line item in the budget. When the car stopped under the grand portico, Cassian stepped out and waited. He didn't reach for her. He had learned early in life that forced comfort was just another form of aggression. He simply held the door open and watched as she climbed out, her worn sneakers clicking softly against the heated marble of the driveway. She stopped at the threshold of the massive iron doors, looking up at the towering expanse of the house. From this angle, she looked impossibly small, a tiny survivor of a shipwreck standing before the gates of a cold, indifferent heaven. "Is this it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the estate's power grid. Cassian didn't ask what she meant. He knew. She was looking for the place where unwanted things went. She was looking for the end of the line. "This is my house," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt like a grounding wire. "You're not leaving until I say so." He led her inside, his boots echoing with a sharp, military precision that contrasted with the soft, hesitant patter of her footsteps. The foyer was a cathedral of obsidian and light, filled with minimalist sculptures that looked like frozen weapons and glass walls that looked out over the churning, dark water of Lake Michigan. There were no photographs on the walls, no soft edges, no signs of life that hadn't been bought and paid for. His head of security, a man named Enzo who had seen Cashin walk through fire without blinking, stood in the hallway. Enzo looked at the girl, then at the mud-stained doll in Cashin's hand, and then at the floor. He didn't ask questions. In Cashin's world, the boss's silence was the only law that mattered. Cashin walked her toward the east wing, past rooms filled with mahogany desks and monitors displaying global markets and security feeds. Amaris walked in the center of the hallways, careful not to let her damp dress brush against the whitewashed walls. She was navigating his home like a minefield, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement of the guards in the periphery. She wasn't looking at the luxury. She was looking for the exits. He stopped in front of the guest suite that had remained empty for 3 years. It was a room of soft grays and deep blues, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, and a bed that could have held 5 of her. "You'll stay here," Cashin said. He walked to the center of the room and placed the mud-stained doll on the edge of the dresser. It looked grotesque against the polished wood, a reminder of the wet street and the life she had been plucked from. Amaris stood by the door, her hands clutched at the hem of her pink dress. She looked at the bed, then at the vast, empty space of the room. She didn't run to the window to see the view. She didn't marvel at the velvet curtains. Instead, she found the smallest corner of the room, near the heavy oak wardrobe, and stood there. "Mister," she said, her eyes finally meeting his. They were too old for her face, filled with a systematic patience that made Cashin's chest tighten. "Do the unwanted kids have to stay in the corners? Is that the rule?" Cashin Varelli, a man who had never once doubted his own shadow, felt the foundations of his fortress shift. He looked at the girl, then at the Iron King reflected in the dark glass of the window behind her. "There are no corners here, Amaris," he said, the words feeling heavy and foreign in his mouth. "And there are no more rules about being wanted. There is only the door, and I'm the only one with the key." He walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her in the quiet luxury of her new cage. He stood in the hallway for a long time, listening. He didn't hear her cry. He didn't hear her move. He only heard the silence of the fortress, which for the first time in 20 years felt far too loud. Cashin stood in the master bathroom, the door clicking shut with a heavy, pressurized finality that echoed the silent vaults beneath the estate foundation. The mud-stained doll sat on the white marble counter, a symbolic casualty looking like a jagged wound against the sterile, expensive stone. Outside the glass, Chicago continued its indifferent, rhythmic drumming, but inside the penthouse, the silence was of the pressurized kind, the sort that fills a space where a child's sound should be, but isn't. He looked at his own hands in the mirror, his sharp jawline tight, with a tension he couldn't name. His hands and neck were etched with ink, visible tattoos that told stories of a man built out of harder materials. He was a man who moved markets and buried men who underestimated him. He had no business holding something as fragile as a plastic child. He turned the tap, the water running hot and clear, steam beginning to fog the mirrors. He didn't call for a maid or his head of security. Enzo. This was a private matter, a debt with no address, that he had carried since the moment he saw the locket around Amaris's neck. He picked up a silk cloth and a bar of soap that smelled of sandalwood and old money. The doll's light brown hair was a matted nest of gray silt and city grime. Its pink dress was stained with the smell of wet concrete and the memory of an abandoned street. With the focused precision of a man who had trained for high-stakes moments where panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, Cashin began to work. He dipped the cloth and began to scrub the doll's face, watching the grime swirl down the drain. The filth of the streets, the evidence of the broker's neglect. He cleaned the plastic eyes, the small nose, and the tiny hands with systematic patience. It was a methodical process, a brutal arithmetic applied to a soft surface. He wasn't just cleaning plastic, He was attempting to wash away the architecture of fear he had seen in Amoris's ancient measuring look. As he worked, he thought of the unwanted list he had uncovered. The way children were treated as merchandise or inventory by men like the broker. Cashin had spent his entire professional life believing that attachment was structural weakness, and that love was merely a door left unlocked in a house full of enemies. But as the doll's original pink color began to emerge from beneath the mud, he felt a specific helplessness. He realized that all his money and force could not simply shoo away the bruise on a child's soul. He spent 40 minutes on the task, not hovering, just present in the rhythm of the work. When he was finished, he wrapped the doll in a warm, dry towel. He used a fine comb to untangle its hair until it looked like it belonged to the world that didn't know hers existed. The doll wasn't perfect. There were scratches on the plastic that would never come out, but it was whole again. He walked back to the guest suite, his footsteps low, rhythmic, barely above breathing. He pushed the door open 3 inches. Amoris was still in the corner, her body rigid, even as she sat on the warm marble floor. She was watching the room with the systematic patience of a child who had learned that understanding your environment was the difference between safe and not safe. Cashin didn't reach out to her. He simply walked to the dresser and placed the clean, dry doll back in its place. He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold, his rugged frame casting a long shadow into the room. "It's clean," he said, his voice low and steady and true. "The mud doesn't live in this house." He didn't wait for a response or a sound that might have been humming. He walked back to his office, where the broker's file sat on his desk, a variable he was about to remove from the city's calculations. He sat in the dark for a long time afterward, not working, just sitting in a silence that felt, for the first time in years, like exactly enough. The third night in the glass fortress began not with a sound, but with the specific, pressurized silence that fills a space when something essential is missing. Cashin had been in his office reviewing the broker's file, his mind a cold calculation of territory and leverage, when he felt the shift in the estate's equilibrium. He walked to the guest suite and found the bed perfectly made, the gray cashmere throw folded with an absolute practice neutrality that suggested no one had ever been there at all. He didn't call Enzo or the perimeter team. He knew the geometry of his own house, and he understood the arithmetic of the hunted. He found her in the depths of the master suite's walk-in closet, tucked behind a row of heavy charcoal overcoats. Amoris was cross-legged on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, with the clean doll clutched so tightly her knuckles were pale. She wasn't crying. She was simply rigid, waiting for a version of tomorrow her body still believed was coming. "It's past midnight," Amoris, Cashin said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the dark of the closet like a steady thing in the room that didn't move or disappear. She didn't look up. She deployed her silence sparingly, as if words were a currency she couldn't afford to waste. She was cataloging this world with the systematic patience of someone who knew that understanding your environment was the difference between safe and not safe. To her, the vastness of the bedroom was a liability, but the closet was a safe room, a place where the shadows had been accounted for. "The bed is too big," she whispered, the sound barely above breathing. Cashin leaned against the doorframe, his ink black and precise, tattoos catching the dim light. He didn't force her out. He knew that old fear doesn't vanish just because the walls are made of reinforced glass. He simply sat on the floor a few feet away, not close enough to startle her, but present. Then there was the matter of the survival habits that played out in the kitchen. Cashin watched the security feeds from his office, a habit, the inability to occupy a room without working. He saw Amoris pat back down the hallway at 3 a.m., her worn sneakers making no sound on the marble. She wouldn't eat when the table was set for her, when the silence of avoidance made the dining room feel like a battlefield. Instead, she moved carefully, methodically, toward the kitchen island. On the screen, Cashin watched her hand move under the counter, wrapping her fist around a piece of cold toast Marcello had left out. She didn't need it there. She pocketed it, storing it for the dark hours before dawn. She ate only when she thought the fortress was sleeping, sitting in the corners back against the wall, where she could see every entrance. It was a complicated, private ritual, a deep and unused instinct for preservation. She ate in the present tense only when she felt the room was safe enough to simply exist in, which, for now, was only in the dark. Cashin stayed in his office until the sun began to fog a small circle against the windows. He realized that attachment was structural weakness, a door left unlocked, but he found himself not reviewing the file, just watching the girl on the screen. He was a man who had handled everything in his life with money or force, yet he was looking at a problem that neither could touch. By the time the estate came alive at dawn, the bread was gone from the pantry, and Amaris was back in her closet. Cashin stood at the window, looking at the city burning with light, and understood that the rules changed tonight. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man carrying a debt to a ghost, and he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that the girl in the shadows never had to hide her hunger again. The fourth morning in the glass fortress arrived with a pale, grudging light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the dark ribbon of a lake into a sheet of hammered silver. Cashin sat at his mahogany desk, a document open beside his coffee, a habit born of the inability to occupy a room without working. He was deep in the brutal arithmetic of the broker's pipeline when the silence of the room changed, shifting from the hollow quiet of an empty office to the pressurized stillness of a room that was no longer solo. Amaris stood in the doorway, her small frame framed by the cold obsidian of the hall. She was holding Button, the clean doll, tucked tightly under one arm, and she was watching him with that ancient measuring look that children who have been hurt use to study the thing living behind an adult's face. Cashin didn't look up immediately. He had learned that an invitation could be the wrong move for a creature trying to decide if the environment was safe. He simply kept his eyes on the page, a steady thing in the room that didn't move or threaten. Slowly, she approached, her footsteps a soft, hesitant patter on the warm marble floor. She didn't stop until she was standing directly at the edge of the desk, her breath fogging a small circle against the polished wood. She wasn't looking at the documents or the screens displaying the city's indifferent warnings. She was staring at his hands. Cashin's hands were a ledger of a life lived in the shadows. The ink was black and precise, coiled around his wrists and disappearing beneath his shirt cuffs like the tail of something dangerous. He set the pen down, the link of his movements clicking into place with a professional tension. "Are they drawings?" she whispered, her voice deployed sparingly, only after the cost of the words had been calculated. "They're stories," Cashin said, his voice low and steady, built of the same harder materials as the fortress around them. She reached out one frozen finger, hesitant, checking whether the structure would hold. When he didn't flinch or pull away, she placed her small, cold hand flat against the back of his, her palm covering the jagged, rendered head of the vulture etched into his skin. She traced the lines with the systematic patience of a child cataloging her world. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her eyes moving from the ink to the faint, white line of a scar that cut through the bird's wing, a remnant of a night in an alley where the smell of wet concrete and copper had been the only reality. "The ink didn't," Cashin replied, keeping his face honest because she was looking for what she needed to prepare for. "The scar did, but only for a while." He stayed completely still, letting her weight settle against his hand as she studied the markings. He realized then that he had spent his entire life believing that attachment was structural weakness, a door left unlocked in a house full of enemies. Yet, as her small finger traced the fierce architecture of his history, the rigid line of his own shoulders softened by degrees. "Mama said scars were just places where we were stronger than the thing that tried to break us," Amaris murmured, her eyes closing briefly as if absorbing the weight of the thought. Cashin looked at the girl, at the way she held the doll, at the locket that rested against her chest, the same way she held the things that meant she would be okay. He understood, then, that she wasn't just looking at the ink. She was searching for the names of the things she was currently surviving. "Your mother was right," he said quietly, his voice catching the morning light. "Some scars are stories. They remind us that the present tense is a place worth existing in." Amaris didn't smile, but something moved through her expression, complicated, private, and fast, before it folded back into her usual composure. She leaned slightly until her shoulder rested against his arm, her legs swinging in the large chair she had climbed into. Cashin didn't pick up the pen. He didn't return to the file or the war that was waiting for a single word from him. He stayed exactly where he was, a man in a black suit and a girl with a worn doll, sitting in a silence that felt, for the first time in 20 years, like exactly enough. The broker's shadow didn't announce itself with a scream. It arrived in a thick, matte black briefcase that Enzo placed on the mahogany desk at 2 a.m. The estate was silent, the kind of pressurized quiet that fills a space where a child is sleeping behind 8 inches of reinforced steel. Cashin opened the file, his face a mask of absolute practiced neutrality, though his eyes had entered that specific, dangerous state that meant he had finished deliberating. Inside were the ledgers of a system designed to consume children the city had decided not to protect. The unwanted list wasn't a list of names. It was an operational infrastructure where human beings were moved like inventory. Cashin scanned the pages with the focused precision of a man who understood that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Each entry was a transaction, a placement authorized by men like Marcus Vance, who purchased discretion with the patience of a man who thought in decades. The broker had built a pipeline that ran beneath Chicago's near north side, invisible to a city that preferred not to look too closely at the brutal arithmetic of its own shadows. He found her on the 17th page. There was a file photograph of Amaris, the same one taken upon her entry into the system. She was wearing a thin, gray shirt 2 sizes too large, and her hair was unkempt, but her eyes were already reading the camera with that ancient, measuring look. In the bottom corner of the photograph, handwritten in red pen, was a number, a dollar amount. Cashin looked at that number for a long time. To the broker, she was merchandise with a assigned value, a liability to be moved across the city for a profit. The ledger detailed the men who had hurt her, foster fathers who were professional cleaners, and independent contractors who had never lost a placement to a formal investigation despite numerous complaints. They were technical, methodical, the kind of organization that treated violence like a load-bearing problem. They had turned the concept of unwanted into a negotiating position. Cashin stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below him, the city burned with light, indifferent to the fact that he was currently reorganizing everything he believed about attachment as structural weakness. He had built an entire life on the principle that love was a door left unlocked in a house full of enemies. But looking at the dollar amount next to Amaris's face, he realized that emotion was no longer the relevant tool. He needed the arithmetic of men in a confined space where precision is the only currency that spins. He picked up his phone and called Enzo. "Find everyone on this list," he said, his voice low, still, and even the register of a man conducting a meeting, which was somehow worse than any other. "I want to know when they sleep." He turned back to the desk and picked up the photograph of the girl in the gray shirt. He thought of her small, cold fingers in his and the way she checked under her bed every night, both sides twice. Because of the fear, old fear doesn't vanish. The broker had misunderstood what pressure points do to men who have already decided they have nothing left to lose except one thing. Cashin closed the folder and moved it to the safe. The war was not finished. It had barely started, but he now understood with complete clarity what he was willing to burn the entire world down to protect. Some words like unwanted, once written in red pen, changed the architecture of a man permanently. It started at 2 a.m., not with a scream, but with the pressurized kind of silence that fills a space where sound should be. Cashin was at his desk, the broker's file open before him, when he heard it through the reinforced walls, a sound smaller than a scream and worse. It was the low, rhythmic noise a child makes when they have learned that screaming brings no one, a sound of someone trying to survive something entirely alone because alone is all they have ever known. He was in the hallway before he decided to move. He pushed the guest room door open 3 inches and found Amaris tucked in a vast bed, but her body was rigid, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her eyes were squeezed shut against a horror, happening entirely inside her head, and her knuckles were pale from how hard she clutched the clean doll. Cashin stood in the doorway, a man who had handled every problem in his life with one of two tools, money or force. He was the Iron Vulture, a man who moved markets and buried enemies. Yet he was looking at a problem that neither tool could touch. The specific helplessness of it was unlike anything he had encountered in 20 years of being a man who was never helpless. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not close enough to startle her, but present, a steady thing in the dark that said she was not alone without requiring her to respond. Seconds passed into minutes. Her breathing remained trapped, a jagged rhythm of someone drowning while sitting still. Then, from somewhere so deep and unused he hadn't known it still existed, a song surfaced. It was a lullaby his mother had sung in a small, loud apartment in Naples when the world outside was violent in a different way. He hadn't thought of it in over 2 decades. It belonged to a version of himself he had deliberately buried when he built Cashin Varelli out of harder materials. He began to sing it, his voice rough and low, not particularly well, but steady and true. The melody was simple, carrying more in its shape than its words. As the notes moved through the room, Amoris's breathing began to change. The rigid line of her shoulders softened by degrees. Her grip on the doll loosened. Not a release, but the difference between bracing for a blow and simply holding a friend. By the 3rd time through the verse, her breathing had found a different rhythm, the slower, deeper cadence of someone descending toward actual rest. Her eyes opened slowly, the heavy-lidded look of a child surfacing from deep water. She found him sitting there in the dark, still present, not having moved or left or turned away. She looked at him for a long moment as the last note settled into the silence. She didn't speak, but she didn't retreat back into the corner of the room. She reached out, her small hand finding the sleeve of his black suit, and held on. Cashin stayed until her breathing deepened completely. He reached over and adjusted the blanket carefully without waking her, then sat in the dark for a long time afterward. He didn't return to the broker's file or the plans for revenge. He just sat in a room where a child slept safely, in a silence that finally felt like exactly enough. He had always believed that attachment was structural weakness, a door left unlocked. But as he watched her, he realized he was willing to burn the entire world down to keep that door closed. They came at midnight, not from the front. The broker's men were technical and methodical, the kind of organization that treated violence like an engineer treats a load-bearing problem. They identified the structure, found the weakness, and prepared to apply precise force to cause a total collapse. They arrived from 3 directions simultaneously: the service entrance, the parking structure, and the roof access via a neighboring tower whose security had been quietly compromised 72 hours earlier. Cashin's system flagged the breach at 11:58 p.m., providing exactly 2 minutes of warning. He was already moving toward the east wing before the alarms could even register in the guard's room. Amoris was asleep when he reached her, but she woke the moment his hand touched her shoulder, not groggy, but fully present in under a second. Children who have lived in dangerous homes do not ease into waking. They arrive there all at once. She looked at Cashin's face, read the professional tension in his eyes, and didn't ask a single question. She simply picked up her clean doll and took his hand. "Go with Enzo," Cashin commanded, his voice as low and, even as a man, confirming a dinner reservation. He led her toward the iron vault beneath the building's foundation, a space of reinforced concrete with its own independent air supply and a door made of 8 inches of steel. Amoris stopped at the threshold and looked at him, searching for what she needed to prepare for. Then, she reached out and pressed her small palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart, the same way she had pressed her palm against the cold window glass to feel the city on the other side. "Don't get shot," she said. "I'll do my best," he replied. Enzo sealed the door at 11:59 p.m. Inside the vault, Amoris sat cross-legged on the floor and waited with the particular steadiness of a child who had learned to survive uncertainty by choosing very deliberately what to believe. She chose to believe the door would open, and she chose to believe it would be on the other side of it. At midnight, the glass fortress came alive. The broker had sent 19 men, a number that looked unfavorable against Cashin's 11 until one understood the geometry of the terrain. Cashin had designed the estate's defensive architecture personally, the way a chess player designs a board they intend to play on for the rest of their life. Every corridor had a purpose. Every shadow had been accounted for. The roof team was the primary threat. 6 men, properly equipped, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They breached the rooftop access and descended into a narrow service corridor. The space was designed for exactly this contingency, a narrow, single-file choke point where numbers stopped matching and only skill remained. Cashin was waiting at the end of it when they came through. What happened in that corridor took 4 minutes and left no ambiguity about the outcome. It was close, fast, and ugly. The brutal arithmetic of men in a confined space where precision is the only currency that spins. Cashin Varelli had not remained the iron vulture of the city for 12 years by delegating everything. By 12:47 a.m., the building was clear. He walked to the vault and used the 4-knock code. When a steel door swung open, he found Amaris sitting exactly where he had left her. She looked up, found his face, and ran her eyes over him, quickly checking, cataloging, and searching for any damage. Finding him whole, she stood up, crossed the vault in 6 steps, and put both arms around his waist. Cashin put one hand on the back of her head. Outside, the war was not finished. It had barely started. But in that moment, in a reinforced room beneath a damaged building, Cashin held the girl and understood with complete clarity what he was willing to burn the entire world down to protect. Everything else could wait. The meeting took place on a Thursday, not in a shadowed alleyway, but in a clinical, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city's near north side. The brokers sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, dressed in the way of men who consider themselves untouchable, nursing a bourbon with the confidence of someone who believed he was still the most dangerous variable in the room. He was wrong. Cashin Varelli sat across from him, the Iron Vulture, who had spent the last 8 hours dismantling the broker's operational infrastructure with the focused precision of an engineer. Between them lay a surveillance briefcase, its contents a brutal arithmetic of 7 years of moving children like inventory through a system that preferred not to look too closely. Cashin didn't reach for his coffee. He reached for a document that had not come from the broker's files. It was an adoption agreement, formal and complete, with every legal field filled and every requirement satisfied by an attorney whose discretion had been purchased with the price of a kingdom. He turned the pages toward the broker, the motion as slow and deliberate as a man conducting a funeral. "You went through my property," the broker said, his voice carrying the professional tension of a man realizing the conversation he prepared for was not the one he was in. "I went through a ledger of liabilities," Cashin replied, his tone low and even a register that was somehow worse than any display of rage. "You called her merchandise. You assigned her a dollar value and moved her through a pipeline designed to consume what the city chose not to protect." Cashin slid a second document across the table, a signed transfer of the South Side docks and his permanent seat on the Syndicate Council. It was his throne, the structural foundation of his power, offered as a trade for a single signature on a line marked Amaris Varelli. The power players in the room, men who viewed attachment as a structural weakness, watched in a silence that felt like a hell breath. They had never seen the Iron King trade his crown for a child. "You're giving up the territory for a 6-year-old? The broker asked, a small, incredulous sound in the back of his throat. "I am giving up a liability to secure an asset," Cashin said, though his eyes betrayed the lie. "You called her a burden. I call her daughter." The broker picked up the pen. The overhead light hummed as he signed, the scratch of the nib on paper the only sound in the pressurized room. Cashin collected the document, examining the signature with the same systematic patience he brought to a war. He stood, buttoning his jacket, and looked at the man one final time. "She checks under her bed every night," Cashin said, his voice cutting through the clinical air. "Both sides twice. That is the architecture of fear you left in her. I will spend the rest of my life replacing it." He walked out of the room, holding the piece of paper that said, in the formal language of the law, would have been true since the moment a shivering girl in a pink dress asked where unwanted things went. The drive back to the glass fortress took 20 minutes, and he held the document the entire way, not reviewing it, but simply holding it the same way Amorous held her clean doll. He was no longer the iron vulture of a criminal empire. He was a man returning home to a child who finally had a name that meant she was okay. The park was loud with the grudging quality of a Chicago March, a city that had been winter for 5 months and was finally, irritably, agreeing to reconsider. The sky was a pale, bright blue, and around them, children moved across the grass in the chaotic way of small people who had been kept inside too long. Cashin sat on a bench near the water, his rugged frame encased in a gray cashmere coat that felt lighter than the black armor he usually wore. He was no longer that iron vulture, reviewing a ledger of liabilities. He was a man watching a girl in a pink coat and new white shoes, the ones Enzo had selected with the gravity of a jeweler offering something precious. Amorous moved through the grass with the clean doll tucked loosely under her arm, no longer clutching it with the white-knuckled grip of a child bracing for a storm. She still checked the perimeter of the playground once, an absolute practiced neutrality in her eyes as she cataloged the exits, but she didn't linger in the shadows. Instead, she hummed a low, rhythmic melody, the same one Cashin had sung in the dark of the guest suite, and she did it openly, without stopping when footsteps passed. She stopped near a patch of early blooming crocuses and sat down on the pavement, placing the doll in the sun. 3 months ago, she had asked where unwanted kids went, voiced like she was trying not to cost the world anything by existing. Now, she simply sat in the present tense, watching the light move across the doll's face. She wasn't looking for the last door on the street, because she had already walked through the golden doors of a fortress that had become a home. Cashin watched her from the bench, his ink-black and precise tattoos hidden beneath his sleeves, though the architecture of the man had been permanently reorganized. He had spent his life believing that attachment was structural weakness, but as Amorous looked back at him and gave a small, tentative smile, one that held for more than 3 seconds, he realized that love was the only door worth leaving unlocked. "Mister," she called out, her voice no longer small or trapped. "Yes, Amorous," he replied, his voice a steady thing that didn't disappear. "The sun is warm today," she said, squinting at the pale March light. "It feels like the house." Cashin felt the weight of the adoption document in his pocket, a piece of paper that had finalized what his heart had already decided in a warehouse in Pilsen. She was no longer merchandise or a dollar amount written in red pen. She was Amorous Elena Varelli. "It is," Cashin said quietly, leaning back as the pressurized silence of his old life was finally replaced by the rhythm of someone actual rest. Amorous picked up her doll and walked back to the bench, climbing up beside him until her shoulder rested against his arm. She didn't ask about unwanted kids or the place they go because she had found a one man who would burn the entire world down to protect her. They sat like that, a man who had traded his throne for a name and a girl who had found her present tense, while the city moved and the lake held its opinion. And for the first time in 20 years, it was exactly, entirely everything. The journey of Cashin and Amorous teaches us that true strength isn't found in a fortress of stone, but in the courage to be a steady thing for someone else. Cashin learned that attachment is not a structural weakness, but the foundation of a life worth living. Ultimately, the story proves that no soul is truly unwanted. They're simply waiting for a place where the mud doesn't live. True power is the ability to trade a throne for the safety of a child who finally knows they belong. The story teaches that true strength is not found in power, wealth, or fear, but in compassion and the courage to protect the vulnerable. A man known for cruelty and control discovered that kindness could change not only a child's life, but his own heart. The little girl, once labeled unwanted, reminded him that every person deserves love, safety, and a place to belong. Sometimes the strongest people are those willing to change, sacrifice, and stand up for someone who cannot protect themselves. In the end, real power is not dominating others, but choosing empathy and giving hope to someone who thought the world had forgotten them. But don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from.